Everyone said Calvin had wronged me, and for a while, even I believed it. After Calvin left the lab, I was promoted from intern to full-time staff and started my own research. I no longer had to do tedious work like data checks and research, so I had more time on my hands. In the evening, I'd stand in the corridor of the laboratory, looking through the small window to the evening sky. I remember Calvin also loved standing here watching the sunset. He always finished his work faster than me, and when I'd exit the lab, I'd hear him reminding me, "Remember to wash your hands and disinfect." While washing my hands, I'd sneak peeks at him. He stood by the window, speaking about research directions, project progress, and the role of new materials and energy use. Once he finished, he would turn to me and ask, "Have you finished washing? Let's eat at the cafeteria." All my memories of Calvin were vivid in my mind, and I could clearly remember every word he uttered in each memory. Our acquaintance began at a middle school chemistry competition. In our small town, I thought no one could compete with me in chemistry. The same students took part in the competition every year. Initially, I viewed them as rivals until they started questioning me. "Were you also forced by the teacher to participate?" When the competition ended, I expected to proudly accept the first prize. However, to my disbelief, the teachers announced a score higher than mine. The first time I heard the name Calvin, I was caught in utter surprise when a gust of wind blew past me and a boy brushed past to walk on stage. He wore a stiff white shirt and looked different from boys our age. I overheard whispers around me. "Who's that? Which school is he from? He looks like he deserved the award." In that competition, there were no first or second prizes, only one outstanding competitor, and I fell into the category of those who did not win any medal. Back then, I was rather proud and felt people looking at me differently. So, I walked over to Calvin and proposed that we become friends, collaborate on experiments, and joked, "Let's compete for the first place again next year," holding a red certificate in his hand. Calvin looked at me emotionally and retorted, "You can continue to be your champion next year. I won't be attending high school here." He looked down on the small town's competition. "It's champions and me." I gulped and asked angrily, "Where are you going to high school then?" "The first high school in the city." He glanced at me arrogantly. The tone and look in his eyes seemed to say you wouldn't be able to get in. Ever since then, Calvin and I became rivals. I joined the city high school with a score 1 point higher than him, entered the top classes with a score 2 points higher in the first term examination. However, he beat me by 50 points and left my name at the bottom of the score list in the following monthly exam. Throughout the 3 years of high school, we never missed any chemistry competition. "Calvin, are you participating in the school competition?" "Calvin, are you participating in the city competition?" "Calvin, are you participating in the provincial competition?" "Calvin, are you participating in the national competition?" Despite my persistence, Calvin's attitude began to change. From initially disregarding me to gradually acknowledging the threat I posed. "You can't make it. You're asking for humiliation. You can't beat me. Natalie, see you at the competition." In our senior year of high school, we had to choose between the arts or sciences. My chemistry was great, but my physics was barely passable. For safety's sake, I should have chosen arts, but I found no interest in it. I was in a bind, listening to outside advice. Of course choose arts, it's easier than science. Arts? What's important to your interest or your future? Just follow your heart if you want to choose science. Choose science. In the end, I couldn't resist asking Calvin. He looked at me inferently from his thick chemistry material, as if I'd asked a foolish question, and said, Science, but I can't keep up with physics." "Hell, study to death." I was struck with surprise and didn't know how to respond. Calvin thought nothing was wrong with what he said, gave me a brief look, and went back to his book. I sat across him and noticed that he seemed to have grown better looking than before. Strangely, after that day, I no longer had any doubts about choosing arts or sciences, even when I felt down about not being able to boost my physics scores. Whenever I thought of Calvin's words, "Study to death," it would guide me like a blind path for the blind street. In my senior year, due to the pressure of the examinations, I was unsuccessful in this year's city competition and fell out of the top 3. I acted indifferent, but it affected my mindset for the mock tests. After one poor performance, I fell into a dip. After self-study was over, I leaned against the corridor railings, looking at the dark night sky above the teaching building, feeling desperate about if I could be admitted to a university. When most students had left, only Calvin stayed in the classroom studying till the last minute. He came out and saw me. I started crying involuntarily under his gaze. He was angry with me. Either you roll over this rail right now, or wipe your tears right now. My mentality was not catching up with my abilities. Whenever there was the slightest setback in competition or examination, I would act gloomy. In others' presence, I tried to give an impression of being strong and gritty, but it was different with Calvin. He was well aware of my low resistance to stress. At first, he'd comfort me. Don't cry. There's always a next time, just work harder. Later, he started to grow impatient, scolding me, can you do it? If you can't, just quit school. I always believed that was just Calvin's character, and I also thought he treated me differently from others. In the last national competition in high school, Calvin and I were partners. We ranked first with a high score. I remember it was 3 weeks before the college entrance examination. The competition brought us high attention and some advantages in college admission. After the competition, there was a television interview. Calvin and I stood side by side. He held the microphone in the middle. The early summer sun shined on our faces. It wasn't too hot. We were national champions just off the field, about to face the battlefield of the high school entrance exam. We were ambitious and energetic teenagers. The reporter asked, having to balance studies and competitions, do you find it too exhausting? Calvin responded arrogantly, no, not tired. I snorted and said, it's quite easy for me. Once I finished, I heard Calvin laugh in a mocking tone, but it was quite muted, only audible to me. The reporter asked again, anything you want to say to each other? I looked at Calvin. He was already 19 and much taller than me. As soon as I felt he was about to look back, I quickly averted my eyes and looked at the reporter and said, let's give it our all in the college entrance exam. He also said, let's do our best. After the college entrance examination, I was admitted to a top university majoring in materials. As I wished, because of the national champion title, the professor of the lab paid great attention to me, and soon after the semester began, he gave me the privilege of observing in the lab. Experience is the best teacher, so they say. I almost stepped directly into the lab out of excitement, but someone grabbed my collar. At that moment, I felt like a complete newbie who knew nothing about chemistry. The person who grabbed my collar was behind me. His voice came from above my head. He asked me, aren't you going to wear a lab coat? I looked back and saw a man wearing a mask and goggles, fully protected, but I recognized his voice and his eyes. I broke free from his grip, frowned, and said in a tone of fake irritation, why is it you? Why are you surprised that it's me? He pushed me away and strode into the lab. During the holiday, I had to ask around among several classmates before I found out which university Calvin had been admitted to. Some people asked me why I didn't ask him directly, given that we were admitted to the same university. I refused. I had my pride. If Calvin didn't seek me out, I would never seek him out. I quickly put on my lab coat, mask, goggles, and gloves. Following Calvin's steps, I whispered, on the second day of school, the professor found me and told me to come to the lab. Calvin scoffed and took a glance at me. I came to the lab during the holiday. The professor brought me here personally. I felt inferior and thought to myself how annoying this guy was, always trying to suppress me wherever we were. After entering university, I felt like a frog finally out of the well, realizing that the title of national champion wasn't so special after all. There were national champions every year, with many more capable than me, occasionally. During intense discussions about a topic, my opinions were rejected. I was looked down upon, my pride was trampled, and my ignorant self-conceit was much smoothed out. In the intense competition, I didn't have time to contact Calvin, but I constantly tried to keep up with his pace, not allowing myself to fall behind him too much. We met in public classes, refuting each other's views. Once, in a heated exchange, I sent him a text after class, "You're sick." He replied, "You can't refute me with a solid argument. You're not good enough." We met in the cafeteria. While queuing, I turned my head and gloated. "Calvin, the topic you proposed earlier, the professor asked me to write on it." He lowered his eyes and watched my smug face. "Hand it in for my review once you're done." We met in the lab. The teacher asked him to organize the data. I mocked him. "You can only do such data organizing work." He glanced at me. "You will have to stand in the corner for many years before you can start organizing data." I always thought we could get closer in this kind of competition. I never thought there might be something wrong with this way of getting along. I liked Calvin, and I was happy to talk about experiments with him every day. But what about Calvin? In my sophomore year, our mentor assigned us to collaborate on a project researching a new material. As we left the office, I playfully reached out my hand to Calvin, saying, "Looking forward to our collaboration." He simply high-fived me, too lazy to respond verbally. Under the lights of the administrative building, I watched Calvin's retreating figure. Suddenly, the mental image of him crossing the stage to receive an award came to mind. As these two images merged, I found joy in the feeling of possessing a priceless treasure. This project bound us together, giving me a sense of ownership over Calvin. His passion for the project far exceeded mine. As I sometimes got lost in my thoughts, he was completely immersed in the research. Once a girl from his class invited him to her birthday party. It was apparent to everyone that she had feelings for Calvin. That day, I felt restless and couldn't stay in my dorm or the library. I went to the lab, where the intense and restrained atmosphere somehow managed to calm me down. I sent Calvin an obviously contrived message, asking for the location of the previous data report, hinting that I was in the lab. Sending the message made me feel petty and regretful. Around 7 or 8 in the evening, the lab door was pushed open. Calvin, dressed in lab attire, strode in impatiently, asking what's all this about the data report. Wasn't it agreed that I would be in charge of that? His sudden appearance left me dumbfounded. I sat up straight, staring at him. His hands were on the table. He opened his computer and began checking the data. The harsh lab light illuminated his broad back. He looked back at me. "What are you staring at? Don't you need the data? Why did you come back?" I told him I had to see my girlfriend. "Did you really say that? How else could I escape the situation?" "Did you really go see your girlfriend?" I asked cautiously. After consuming so much K-drama, I was deluded into hoping that Calvin would follow my lead. In the end, he just looked back at me as if I were crazy, saying, "Madeline, what nonsense are you talking about?" Wishful thinking hit reality as I woke from my half-asleep stupor. Throughout college, from the smallest research meeting to representing the school in provincial competitions, snapshots of Calvin and I frequently appeared in school newspapers. Our names always appeared on reports side by side, as though the world knew we were a dream team. There was a phase wherein I believed my feelings were too obvious. Everyone knew I was in love with Calvin, but if I didn't confess, the world remained silent. I would buy breakfast for Calvin. Initially, he resisted, but later transferred money to me for every meal. I knitted a scarf for him, which he wore only once. On graduation day, while clearing out his room, I saw him toss the dusty scarf into the trash. Asking why, he said the rats in the dormitory had gnawed it open. The boldest thing I did was inviting Calvin to a Valentine's Day dinner. After a 30-minute struggle toward the invitation, he simply responded, "I'm busy." In a mix of hilarity and sadness, I believed he just hadn't fallen for me. Yeah. What's even more laughable was my belief that my sincere and strong feelings could sustain until the eventual day he liked me back. The project assigned to Calvin and me by the professor wasn't a big research project, but it ended up consuming several years of our time. After graduation, the professor recommended both of us to a university lab as co-op internships, and our relationship gradually transitioned from collaboration to competition. At first, I wasn't aware of this change. I would go to find Calvin to eat together during meal times, until one time when their team had a delayed presentation, I waited for him at the office door for an hour. Calvin had sent several messages telling me to go first, but I stubbornly insisted on waiting. Eventually, he came out of the office, pulled me over by my shoulder, directed me towards the corridor, and in a low voice filled with dissatisfaction, he said, "You go ahead. Stop waiting for me. Are you still not done?" "It's okay. I can wait." "Do you not understand the situation?" His tone grew increasingly impatient and his brows furrowed. "Our team is having a meeting. People outside will think you're trying to steal our team's research findings." These two words hit me like two huge question marks. I looked up at him, and under the dim light, Calvin's eyes were murky and complex. I wasn't sure if it was an illusion, but it seemed there was a wrinkle in the corner of his eyes. I was pushed away by him, and only when I reached the cafeteria did I react. I was upset and aggrieved. It felt as though a balloon filled with grievance was inflated inside me, making it difficult for me to breathe. In the end, Calvin sat across me with a tray of food, which seemed to be his way of apologizing. Just as always, when he found me in the cafeteria, sat across from me, and shared a meatball with me, I would no longer be angry at him. The difference this time was that there was another person beside Calvin. I recognized her, a girl from their team named Tiffany. Tiffany wasn't particularly pretty, but she liked to smile, revealing dimples at the corners of her mouth. She seemed to get along well with everyone in the team. Everyone saw her as pure, cute, and kind, unlike me who was perceived as arrogant and rude, and not willing to interact with others. Calvin didn't even say a word to me, but Tiffany occasionally took care of me, who was left out. This was the first time I discovered Calvin could also warm up to others. He could crack jokes, share about his childhood, and talk about trivial matters. He probably only had eyes for Tiffany's dimples now. Tiffany intruded into my life. Calvin and I still had a research collaboration. But since it was during our internship period, the research could only be conducted on campus during the weekends. Calvin used to stay in the lab until 10 at night, but later he left at 6 in the afternoon. I thought he was occupied with important matters until I saw from the lab window that he was busy showing Tiffany around our campus. Ever since then, all the ways Calvin and I interacted were overturned. I had no choice but to face the cruel reality that Calvin developed feelings for someone who was completely unlike me. I wasn't anything special in Calvin's life to the point that I wasn't even one of the earliest to know about him and Tiffany being officially together. In front of the window in the lab corridor, Calvin and Tiffany were chatting, with their silhouettes illuminated from behind. They looked so natural and intimate. With the jokes of others, they looked at each other and laughed. Tiffany was a smart and generous person. She made an excuse to leave whenever she saw me, giving Calvin and me some alone time. I slapped Calvin as hard as I could, to the point where my hand was quietly shaking. His face turned to the side, quickly becoming red. He looked at me in disbelief, but I didn't even give him the chance to ask why. I just turned around and walked away, pretending to be arrogant. People in the corridor didn't see the slap, but they must have heard it. Afterward, everyone said that I was haughty and spoiled, full of bad habits that had been indulged, like a rat crossing the street being targeted by everyone. I was not popular with people, and for the rest of my life, I never won Calvin's heart. I consider that lab accident Tiffany had a taste of her own medicine. Even though it was a minor incident, the explosion destroyed expensive equipment worth tens of millions. Tiffany, a research-less intern, is bound to be dismissed, even though her boyfriend, Calvin, is the most anticipated intern of the same period. There is no room for maneuver in this matter. I was waiting, gloating over her notice of dismissal. The people in the lab seemed to know my resentment for Calvin because of his unrequited love, and since group leader Marcus was pursuing me at that time and many flattering me, I kept hearing people say, "Don't worry. Tiffany will definitely be dismissed." During that time, Calvin was running around for this matter, and he had never been so dejected even when his subject failed to pass the review. Seeing his somewhat embarrassed look made me happy, and I didn't feel sorry at all. There was a vicious voice in my heart screaming, "That's for not choosing me," while he was hitting a wall everywhere. I was smug. Marcus is a successful man, unlike those empty-handed big boys on campus. Marcus has a car and a house, conversation and ambition. He is a skilled hunter who has captured me in my emotional confusion phase. Once, after work, Marcus, who was supposed to be on vacation, drove to pick me up. He got out of his car, opened the co-pilot's door for me, and politely invited me to dinner with him. Not only is the co-pilot, but it also represents money, prestige, the opportunity to turn positive, and the advantage in research. I've always been a proud person since I was a child. I don't think Marcus is a stepping stone for me to climb upwards. I think he just discovered my shining point. Gaining both fame and fortune is inherently mine. He is merely a messenger. I calmly and generously took Marcus's co-driver's seat under the watchful eyes of a dozen or so of my colleagues. He got into the car, leaned in to fasten my seatbelt. If I slightly lowered my head, I could smell the woody scent on him. I saw Calvin through the car window, and he saw me, sitting in the luxury car picking me up. I suddenly felt that he was extremely mediocre. Such an ordinary person had taken up my precious 10 years of youth, and I engraved 4 words in my heart: really not worth it. Dear Calvin, I can't remember the reason why I was hard touched by you. Was it your excellent grades, your firm determination, or your wild and youthful disposition? There was a time when I enjoyed the happiness built up with money, and the determination that I had to have a nation that I had to have as young suddenly disappeared, leaving no trace. I was discontented because, in the end, Tiffany wasn't dismissed. She presented an advanced research that had immense potential even though it hadn't yet yielded specific results. Astonishingly, the research bore her and Calvin's names. Calvin had stolen the research he and I had been working on for years and gave it to Tiffany as an atonement. Everybody knew it. How could they, who had only known each other for a year, produce such research? However, it was that damned interpersonal relationship that kept everyone quiet, pretending not to know. As the victim, people pitied and sympathized with me and felt relieved that I saw Calvin's true colors sooner rather than later. Calvin and Tiffany remained the same, working on experiments and research reports together in the same group, eating together, then going home together. While I was still in a tug-of-war with Marcus, I dared not easily surrender myself to him. The longer I dragged it out, the more benefits I reaped. To date, I found that my mentality had changed, and even my face seemed to have become more harsh. Some genuinely resented them on my behalf, sarcastically commenting in front of Tiffany and Calvin about their shamelessness. Calvin doesn't care about others' opinions due to his aloof personality, but Tiffany suffered, afflicted by rumors to the point where she dare not sit and eat in the cafeteria. Marcus asked me, "Can you swallow this?" "I can't," I replied truthfully. "If they continue to develop this research and make achievements, all the honor will be theirs. You will get nothing. Eventually, they will be able to become permanent staff with this research, and it will be even more difficult for you to get such an opportunity." I looked up and saw Marcus across the dinner table. Each time he invited me to dinner, it was always at the Hilltop restaurant. The view behind him offered a spectacular night scene. I stared at him, half expecting him to say, "Don't worry." But he only stared back, like an outsider. I put down my cutlery, wiped my mouth, and asked, "What do you think I should do? You carried out the tests, you should know it best." He answered, "Indeed, I knew very well. I personally conducted the experiments. I knew the highlights and the shortcomings. Having partnered with Calvin for so many years, I could catch his weaknesses in research. If I wanted to, I could bring them to ruin." At the end of the internship period, the notice for a full-time position would be officially issued at the beginning of the following spring. Toward the end of the year, the work in the lab was entering its final stage. The university town was desolate. All the people in the city were busy preparing for a good new year amidst the winter snow. However, Calvin and Tiffany ended their internship prematurely because of an anonymous tip-off letter. A fatal flaw in their research would undermine the utilization efficiency of clean and massive energy, consequently affecting the world's ecosystem. This flaw was what Calvin and I had planned to address in the later stages. I resigned due to guilt, not just because of research, but also because of rumors. Everyone felt that they had wronged me. If they could still stay in the lab, it would be sheer shamelessness. I watched from the end of the lab corridor as Tiffany and Calvin left. The round and golden setting sun slowly disappeared over the horizon. The dying sunlight shone diagonally, illuminating my face. I never realized how beautiful the sunset viewed from here was. Every time I stood here before, all I could see was Calvin. Calvin? It was the 500th day we entered the lab together, and now you have left? In these 500 days, you watched the sunset 420 times, only 12 of which were with me. After Calvin and Tiffany left the lab, I still often heard criticism of them from my colleagues. Someone said they only seem pitiful, but when it comes to plagiarizing others' research, they're not pitiful at all. They were right. Calvin and Tiffany were not pitiful. They both had intelligence, determination, and courage. They could leave this lab and carve out their own territory in the world of chemistry. As for plagiarizing research, they had never done it. It was me who changed my name on the research report to Tiffany's. Not because my affection for Calvin was so deep, but because I was the one who did wrong. I was jealous of Tiffany. She got Calvin, the man I'd been yearning for during my whole youth. That day when she was conducting an experiment in the lab, I went in to get a report. With one glance, I knew what she was doing, how far she had progressed, and what chemical fluid could cause a small-scale explosion if poured into the liquid container next. I corroded the label so it was vague and put it beside her. She was a bit careless but not stupid. The day after the incident, she knew it was me who had deliberately harmed her. Calvin pulled me into the stairwell and questioned me. I looked at Calvin arrogantly, showing no remorse. "Do you have any evidence it was me?" I provoked. "If you have evidence, then take your girlfriend and report me. If not, don't bother me." Later, I thought about it and realized that there were plenty of evidence. Even without surveillance cameras, my fingerprints would be on the liquid bottle. In the end, Calvin and Tiffany did not report me. They chose to shoulder the consequences and found other ways. As for me, on the surface, I seemed perfectly content, but I was racked with guilt and frightened to the core. I knew that if Tiffany was truly expelled, I would be tormented by guilt till I had a mental breakdown. So I suggested giving that research to Tiffany as a lifeline. Tiffany was very kind-hearted. She was as if she had been reborn from despair, and her eyes were filled with tears as she gripped my hand and thanked me. I was not kind-hearted. I was a bad person, a coward who didn't dare to admit my mistakes, nor brave enough to say a word of apology. Calvin was standing next to us at that moment. I dared not look at him and finally bowed my head. I wasn't changed by their forgiveness when I saw them together in the lab. Looking blissfully paired, the hatred swept over me again. Too many people had said that they had wronged me, to the point that I started to think it was indeed them who had wronged me. When spring came, I got a full-time position in the lab, and for the first time in those years, Calvin took the initiative and asked me to dinner. He just congratulated me on the promotion without mentioning anything else. 3 rounds of drinks later, it was me who brought up the past. I asked him, "Why didn't you and Tiffany report me then?" He counter-questioned me subconsciously. "How could I report you?" It was like when he refuted my points in a public lecture back in college. I thought I saw a glimpse of his youthful self in his reactions. He was once as proud as me, but life's disappointments had shattered his youthful spirit. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "You're my friend. You've been my friend for so many years. How could I report you?" He raised his glass to toast with me, and I drank and cried at the same time. I was unfaithful to the role of being a friend. I coveted the role of a lover, and I betrayed our friendship because of this desire. But this wasn't a pure, lasting longing. I thought my affection for Calvin has lasted 10 years, and it was profound enough to move heaven and earth. Yet, in the end, the moment money and fame tempted me, I cast aside this affection without a second thought. I was invited to Calvin's wedding at a time when we hadn't been in touch for a while. To my surprise, Tiffany, who should have been standing on the stage reciting vows with him, was just sitting in the crowd in casual clothes, greeting me with a smile. We sat together, listening to the host's speech, and started to catch up. I joked, "You were Calvin's first love. Aren't you a little regretful attending his wedding today?" "What's there to regret?" Tiffany, perhaps with a good state of mind, still looked as young as before, her smile creating adorable dimples at the corners of her mouth. How many people in the world can make it to marriage with their first love? I had to admit she was right. My first love, and I didn't make it to marriage either. After becoming a formal employee, I accepted Marcus's pursuit. His practical savvy and worldly wise attitude all applied to me. His feelings were not pure, gradually implementing his own thoughts into my mind, prompting me to cooperate with him to sell experiment data. In my second year there, I disclosed Marcus to the management. In my letter, I spoke openly about all the illegal things Marcus had done in the past year, and also confessed the full story of the Tiffany incident. I received my deserved punishment and eventually resigned from the laboratory. On the day I left, I walked into the sunset. I thought of the window at the end of the corridor. Looking from the window, the departing figure made me lonely and desolate. But when I was truly on this path, I felt relieved. Actually, Calvin and I argued every day after we resigned. Tiffany's voice pulled me back to reality. Without thinking, I lowered my gaze, pondering the reason. I couldn't stand leaving the lab just like that. If we exposed you, neither of us would have been affected. But he disagreed strongly. Tiffany sounded a bit melancholic, then exhaled in resignation because he said, "You were his only friend all these years." My eyes moistened. Calvin was also my only friend during those years. The wedding proceeded to the ring exchange. In the midst of the grand wedding music, this boy who had occupied my entire adolescence finally matured into a man with his future life partner standing next to him. I once yearned to stand in that position, but looking back now, such desire was immature and couldn't withstand the test. When Calvin led his bride down to toast, I finally got a clear look at the bride. We caught each other's eyes amidst the hustle and bustle. Then he introduced me, his long-separated old friend, to his new wife, who responded with a gentle smile. After the toast, I watched him lead his bride forward. With each step they took, I melodramatically reminisced about each stage of life that Calvin and I had walked through together. I guess, regardless of how many girls Calvin has met in his entire life, perhaps every girl loved him more than I did.